Given that we're studying in Canada, I think it's probably important for us to take a few minutes to discuss our own central bank, the Bank of Canada. The Bank of Canada was established in 1935 for a couple of reasons. First off, to alleviate the credit crunch that Canada was experienced during the Depression, even though our diversified branch banking networks had enabled us to avoid any kinds of bank failures during the Depression, there was substantial strain placed on the banking system at several points throughout the 1930s. And there was concern about the possibility of bank failures. And so there was a lot of political pressure to encourage the creation of a single central bank. This was hopefully going to replace, in the eyes of many market participants, the role of the Bank of Montreal, who had acted as the federal government's banker since Confederation in 1867. The reason for this being that the Bank of Montreal was the first large commercial banking organization within Canada, and in fact, at the time, the largest banking organization by far in Canada. So unsurprisingly, this largest and most stable of institutions had been the primary agent for the government's fiscal needs. However, in 1935, we shifted towards something that was a little bit, how do we say, less commercially focused by creating a state institution called the Bank of Canada. The Bank of Canada was originally created as a private institution, but we nationalized it within 3 years. And it is today wholly owned and controlled by our government, regardless of the crazy things you might hear on the internet. In terms of governance, the Bank of Canada is overseen by a board of directors who are appointed by the government. Its primary policymaking body is what's called the Governing Council, which is made up of the governor of the Bank of Canada, our current governor, Tiff Macklem, my old boss that you can see up here, as well as 5 deputies who are all, again, appointed by the government. The mandate of the Bank of Canada is mostly focused on price stability through inflation targeting, but they also engage heavily in bank supervision, they act as a lender of last resort, and of course they are the banker to our federal government. And even though the bank does have the authority to set these policies that it thinks are best for achieving these objectives, they obviously can be overridden by the government if it so chooses to. Interestingly to note, in Canada, the government has not ever had to override a governor of the Bank of Canada in terms of policy making, meaning that our technocrats seem to be well chosen and to be painting within the lines established by their controllers within the state. A close call that we did have in the 1950s, though, involved what was called the Coin Affair, when our governor, James Elliott Coyne, found himself being publicly very critical of the government's plan to continue to spend. The Diefenbaker government was deeply affronted by the notion that their central banker would scold them for wanting to maintain price stability while the government was spending expansively, and ultimately Coyne was forced to retire from his position. It's worth noting that his successor, however, demanded that the government sort of stay out of these affairs, but allow it to pursue the government's objectives, but with less direct supervision. And so this has been the standard for behaviors of governors of the Bank of Canada since. There is an understanding between the technocrats that administer the Bank of Canada and the federal government. And this is that technocrats are better positioned to make the kinds of economic choices while our elected officials design the broad objectives. In this sense, the government lays down the objectives or what the central bank tries to accomplish, but doesn't meddle in the tactics that the central bank uses to actually accomplish the objectives set down by the government. To reference an old perspective, Sun Tzu would be very proud. In Art of War, he actually describes one of the main problems of generals in ancient China was that they were constantly interfered with by their sovereigns, who insisted on directing the flow of battle, even though they didn't necessarily have any sort of training in strategies or tactics. And for this same reason, we tend to allow our bank to operate on a technocratic basis in Canada without too much direct interference from the government. Now, there is an interesting current issue with the Bank of Canada, which has been creating some waves over the last year or so. And this has to do with the financing of federal deficits resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic. The government of Canada borrowed enormous amounts of money in order to be able to fund programs like the CRB, et cetera. And of course, it didn't have all this money laying around, so it arranged to borrow this money. Now, you might say, where does the government borrow the money from? Well, it issues bonds, and the Bank of Canada buys these bonds. But the Bank of Canada didn't create new money in order to buy these bonds. The Bank of Canada borrowed it from the other members of Payments Canada for the most part. So money was not being created out of nowhere to finance our federal deficits, but it was being borrowed from us. And this raised some interesting questions about the policy, the independence of the central bank, whether the central bank was monetizing government debts that were not related to the pandemic. Because of the difficulty of determining exactly what government borrowing was related to pandemic spending and which government borrowing was related to an urge to transform society or introduce new social programs, has created a lot of discomfort from people who are quite concerned about the idea of the central bank acting as the government's money printer, as opposed to acting as the government's fiscal agent. And so it remains an open question for us in Canada as to how we should deal with this over 2021 and 22, as we no longer will need such expansive government spending, but we will need to find a way for the Bank of Canada to reduce the size of its balance sheet in years to come.